I thought closing time meant leaving work behind, but 3 women waited for me, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The cafe had emptied slowly, one table at a time, leaving behind a soft echo of clinking cups and murmured goodbyes. I wiped down the counters, the scent of freshly ground coffee lingering in the warm air, mingling with the faint sweetness of pastries cooling on their racks. It was the kind of quiet that settled in your bones, a gentle contrast to the daytime rush. I liked it. It was almost meditative, a pause before the world outside, bright, loud, and uncertain. But tonight, that quiet had a weight to it. I noticed them almost immediately, 3 women lingering by the far corner, their faces framed by the soft cafe light. My first thought was disbelief. Who stayed this late, willingly, waiting for someone like me? They didn't look impatient or restless. Rather, they carried an easy confidence, an effortless grace that drew the eye without demanding it. I felt a flutter in my chest I wasn't entirely ready to name. As I approached, my steps cautious on the polished wooden floor, I noticed the small details that made them impossible to ignore. The faint shimmer of a bracelet catching the lamplight. The subtle scent of a perfume that hinted at roses and vanilla. One of them tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, fingers lingering just long enough to brush against her neck, and I found myself momentarily aware of how close she was. The other 2 exchanged quiet glances, as if sharing a secret that I wasn't yet allowed to hear. I hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge them or pretend I hadn't noticed. My own nervousness felt almost childish under their calm, collected gazes. There was a strange thrill in that moment, the kind that comes from sensing possibility without knowing its shape. My hands, damp from wiping counters, itched to reach for something, anything, to anchor myself. Finally, I cleared my throat, a small, deliberate sound that seemed too loud in the empty cafe. "Hey, can I help you with something?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. They smiled. It wasn't a smile meant to charm or seduce, but one that radiated warmth, curiosity, and a quiet patience. I realized, with a start, that they were waiting for me, waiting to talk, to share, to connect. My pulse quickened, not in fear, but in anticipation. There was something unspoken in the way they leaned slightly toward me, their eyes tracing my movements, their posture relaxed yet deliberate. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, suddenly conscious of the hum of the cafe lights, the faint draft from the open door, the soft scrape of a chair as one of them adjusted her seat. Every sound, every scent, every subtle movement felt magnified, filling the room and, more insistently, filling my mind. For a moment, I wondered if I should retreat to the safety of the empty counter, pretend that I was done for the night. But something in their gaze held me there, rooted in a quiet promise of connection I hadn't expected to find on a Tuesday evening in a cafe that smelled like coffee and possibility. And as I stood there, hesitant yet drawn, I realized this was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, but I already knew I didn't want to let it go. I swallowed my nervousness and stepped closer, letting the polished wood floor creak softly under my weight. "I didn't expect anyone to stay this late," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice carried a trace of curiosity I couldn't quite hide. The 3 women exchanged a glance, the kind that carried unspoken understanding, before one of them spoke. Her voice was calm, warm, and inviting, like a low hum that settled around me. "We didn't want the night to end yet," she said, a small, knowing smile brushing her lips. The other 2 nodded, their eyes lighting up with quiet amusement. I felt my chest tighten in a way that was entirely new. Their presence was commanding yet gentle, and I found myself fumbling for words as they effortlessly filled the space with their calm energy. I gestured toward the chairs near the corner. "Would you like to sit?" They did, and I noticed the tiny, human details that made my pulse quicken. One woman shifted, brushing a hand across her hair and letting her fingers trail briefly along the curve of her neck. Another crossed her legs slowly, the soft swish of fabric punctuating the silence between us. The third leaned slightly forward, resting her elbows on the table, her gaze steady and encouraging, as if silently daring me to step closer into their world. Small talk began, tentative but warm. I asked about their favorite drinks, and they shared little quirks about their coffee preferences, laughter threading through the conversation. It was light-hearted, but it carried a subtle intimacy, the kind that makes you feel seen in the spaces between words. I noticed the way one of them tilted her chin toward me as she laughed, the other's hand brushing mine ever so slightly as she reached for her cup. Every movement seemed deliberate yet unforced, a delicate dance of proximity that left me acutely aware of their presence. As I poured another cup of coffee from the pot, the rich aroma filling the corner, I realized I was listening differently than I had in years. I wasn't just hearing them. I was absorbing the texture of their voices, the rhythm of their gestures, the warmth radiating from their bodies as they relaxed into the late-night stillness. For the first time, I felt like a participant in a story that was unfolding slowly, deliberately, around me. And then, without realizing it, my own nervousness began to dissolve. Their confidence was contagious, their quiet patience reassuring. I found myself laughing more easily, responding with a candor I rarely allowed in public spaces. The subtle physical cues, the brush of a hand, the tilt of a head, the way their eyes met mine with unspoken questions, felt electric without crossing any boundary. Every gesture carried meaning, a whispered invitation to connect deeper, even if only in the small, fragile ways we allowed ourselves in this dimly lit cafe. By the time the conversation shifted to music, books, and the small joys that punctuate life, I was no longer aware of hesitation. I was immersed, drawn into the warmth of their presence, acutely aware of how alive this quiet evening had suddenly become. The nervous excitement in my chest had settled into something richer, a quiet, steady curiosity, and a desire to linger. In that moment, I realized that what had started as a surprise encounter was becoming something rare, a connection that was gentle, slow, and profoundly human, threaded with warmth, subtle tension, and the unmistakable promise of more to come. The cafe seemed to shrink around us, the walls holding the warmth of dim lights and the faint scent of coffee. Outside, the world had already retreated into night, but here, in this quiet corner, time slowed. I leaned back slightly, letting the warmth from the coffee cups seep into my hands, and listened. Really listened. One of the women spoke first, her voice soft but steady, sharing the subtle burdens of her day-to-day life. Projects that drained her, moments of loneliness, the quiet frustration of dreams deferred. Her eyes, a deep shade of hazel, flicked toward mine occasionally, gauging my reaction, seeking a measure of understanding. I found myself nodding, not out of politeness, but from genuine empathy. There was a quiet bravery in her vulnerability that I hadn't expected to witness tonight. The second woman, a graceful figure with silver-streaked hair that caught the lamplight, spoke of past heartbreaks and the awkwardness of navigating life after disappointment. She didn't dwell on sorrow. Instead, she painted her struggles with honesty, a gentle acceptance that felt strangely comforting. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, and for a moment, I felt the unspoken weight of her stories pressing softly against the space between us. I wanted to reach out, to offer some small reassurance, but hesitated, unsure if my presence would intrude or soothe. The third woman shared a dream she had nurtured quietly for years, a creative project, an ambition that had been shelved repeatedly. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of hope and fear, and as she spoke, I noticed a subtle tremor in her hands, the way she twisted a napkin absent-mindedly. It was intimate, almost fragile, and I felt a stirring in my chest. I realized that each of them was revealing pieces of themselves they rarely offered to strangers, and yet, here they were, trusting me with these fragments of their lives. I responded carefully, my words soft but sincere, echoing the empathy I felt. I spoke of my own uncertainties, the quiet anxieties of youth colliding with adult responsibilities. I noticed their expressions shift subtly, the way one woman's hand hovered near mine, brushing the edge of my arm as if by accident, and how another's gaze lingered on me, warm and steady. These small gestures, touches and glances, spoke volumes that words could not. The room seemed charged with quiet resonance. Every laugh was slightly longer than it needed to be, every pause pregnant with meaning. The cafe's warm light caught the curve of a shoulder, the gentle incline of a neck, the subtle rise and fall of a chest in quiet breathing. I was acutely aware of my own heartbeat, synchronized in some unspoken rhythm with theirs. By the end of the evening, I realized that our connection had shifted. It wasn't merely casual conversation anymore. It was a delicate weaving of trust, understanding, and mutual curiosity. In their stories, I found fragments of myself reflected back, not just my own vulnerabilities, but the longing for meaningful connection that I hadn't fully acknowledged. And in that quiet corner, with coffee cups now empty and the night pressing gently against the cafe windows, I understood something profound. These women weren't just waiting for me after hours. They were creating a space where we could meet, truly meet, in ways that would linger far beyond the warm glow of a late evening. The conversation had shifted naturally, moving from stories of struggle to lighter, more playful topics. Laughter now wove through the quiet cafe, soft and lilting, bouncing off the warm walls. I realized I was smiling more than I had in weeks, drawn in by the ease with which they shared this space with me. It was as if the night itself had slowed, waiting for these moments to unfold. It started with the smallest of touches. One of the women reached for her cup, and as her fingers brushed my forearm, the contact lingered just a heartbeat too long. The warmth of her skin surprised me, and I felt an almost imperceptible flutter in my chest. I caught her eyes in that brief moment, and she gave a small, almost shy smile, as though acknowledging the shared electricity of that fleeting connection without needing words. Another moment followed soon after. As I passed behind the chairs to grab a cloth for wiping the counters, one of them shifted, and our shoulders brushed lightly. It was a casual movement, yet in the dim light, it felt intimate, like a quiet affirmation that our worlds were overlapping just a little, safely, without crossing any boundaries. I felt the warmth of her body in the softest way, and my pulse quickened, not with desire, but with awareness. The third woman, sitting closest to the corner, leaned forward to reach for a pastry. Her hand lingered on the table near mine. I didn't move it away. Instead, I let the proximity exist, letting the subtle warmth and the faint brush of her fingers against the edge of my hand speak for itself. There was a rhythm in these touches, gentle and unforced, that seemed to echo the laughter, the quiet pauses, and the understanding building between us. As the night deepened, I noticed the small, unconscious gestures that drew me closer without saying a word. One woman rested her chin lightly on her hand, her elbow brushing against mine. Another played with the edge of her scarf, letting it graze my shoulder when she turned to look at me. The third's gaze held mine just a moment longer than necessary during a shared laugh. Each of these fleeting contacts carried a subtle promise, attention, curiosity, a willingness to exist in this shared space. Internally, I wrestled with my own surprise at how affected I felt by these touches. There was no forwardness, no expectation, just the gentle awareness that our physical proximity was a language of its own. My heartbeat seemed louder in my ears, matching the unspoken cadence of their glances and movements. I was aware of my own warmth, the nervous energy threading through my hands and shoulders, and yet I didn't want to pull away. The evening moved on, and the subtle intimacy continued to grow, almost imperceptibly. I felt the presence of these women around me as a soft, steady pressure, comforting, intriguing, and wholly human. For the first time, I realized that physical closeness didn't need words, and that tension could exist in the brush of a hand, the casual touch of an elbow, the warmth radiating from bodies nearby. It was slow, deliberate, and it was intoxicating in a quiet, almost reverent way. By the end of that part of the evening, I felt a new layer of connection forming, a tactile understanding, a silent dialogue, that promised something deeper than conversation alone could convey. And I knew, without doubt, that the night was far from over, and that each gesture, each fleeting touch, was a carefully placed brick in the fragile bridge growing between us. The laughter had quieted, leaving behind a comfortable stillness that seemed to hum in the warm cafe air. I sipped the last of my coffee, letting the rich warmth settle in my chest, and realized that the night had taken on a gravity I hadn't anticipated. Their smiles, previously playful, now carried an almost imperceptible weight, as if they were inviting me into a space where honesty mattered more than small talk. It was the first woman, the one with the deep hazel eyes, who spoke again. Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as she shared a memory of a past relationship, not the heartbreak itself, but the lingering emptiness it left behind. She described the quiet loneliness of coming home to an empty apartment, the subtle ache of missing someone without knowing why. As she spoke, I found myself leaning in, my own hands resting lightly on the table, wanting to offer some measure of comfort without intruding. The second woman, silver-streaked hair catching the lamplight, added her own story. It wasn't dramatic or tragic, but it was raw in its honesty, a career choice that didn't pan out, friendships that faded, opportunities that slipped past her fingers. Her vulnerability was understated yet magnetic, drawing me into a sense of shared human fragility. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of empathy and something deeper, a pull toward the honesty they offered so freely. I wanted to reach out, to place a reassuring hand on one of theirs, but hesitation gripped me. The age difference, the unexpectedness of this evening, the social boundaries I had always respected, each one whispered caution. I was painfully aware of my own uncertainty, of the quiet questions about what was appropriate, what was imagined, and what was real. And yet, in their presence, the caution felt both necessary and impossible to fully observe. The third woman, sitting nearest the corner, rested her hands lightly on her lap, and spoke about quiet dreams deferred, not failures, but things she had set aside for practicality, for responsibility. There was a vulnerability in her tone, a softness that made me acutely conscious of the space between us. I wanted to lean closer, to say the right words, to acknowledge the weight of her feelings without breaking the unspoken boundary of respect that hovered in the room. As their stories unfolded, I became aware of my own heartbeat, of the subtle warmth that traveled from my chest down to my hands. Every glance, every pause in their speech, seemed deliberate yet gentle, as though testing the waters, seeing how close I could come without rushing. The tension was not sexual, but profoundly intimate, a slow, steady recognition of shared humanity and desire that neither dared to name aloud. I realized that this moment, quiet and fragile, was a crossroads. I could retreat into caution and propriety, or I could lean into the intimacy that had been growing, the slow, delicate trust that they had placed in me. My fingers brushed against the edge of the table, close to theirs, and the warmth of that simple proximity was both terrifying and comforting. For the first time that evening, I understood the weight of hesitation, not as a barrier, but as the space in which something genuine could grow. The room felt charged with unspoken potential, with the quiet hope that what began as casual presence could evolve into something meaningful. And in that delicate, suspended moment, I realized that the night's story was just beginning, and that our emotional connection had reached a depth I hadn't expected. The cafe had grown quieter still, the hum of the street outside softened to a distant murmur. The three women leaned into the dim warmth of the late-night lights, and I felt an almost imperceptible shift in the air around us. Conversation had become secondary, replaced by the language of proximity, glances, gestures, and subtle touches that spoke louder than words ever could. One of the women reached for a pastry, and our fingers brushed lightly in the act. The touch was fleeting, yet it left a ripple that seemed to stretch through the air between us. I felt my pulse quicken, awareness sharpening with every movement. It wasn't desire in the crude sense. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement of closeness and shared presence that had been building all evening. Her eyes met mine in that instant, warm and steady, and I understood the silent question she posed without speaking. Do you feel this too? The second woman tilted her head slightly, her hair falling over her shoulder as she laughed softly at something the third had said. Her laughter was light but carried a lingering warmth, and I noticed the subtle way her elbow brushed mine as she gestured. There was no awkwardness, only a delicate familiarity, an almost imperceptible reassurance that we were all navigating this new closeness together. The third woman, who had been quiet for a while, leaned back in her chair and let her gaze linger on me. Her eyes were thoughtful, curious, and gently probing. I felt the weight of her attention, the kind that makes you both nervous and strangely comforted. I wanted to respond, to reach out, but words felt clumsy here. Instead, I offered a smile, soft and open, and she returned it with a nod that carried agreement and understanding. As the minutes passed, the room seemed to contract around this shared tension, this quiet acknowledgement of mutual attraction. Every small movement, the way one of them brushed her hand against the table near mine, the way another leaned slightly closer to reach for sugar, the subtle shift of weight as they adjusted in their chairs, was amplified in the intimate silence. I could feel the warmth radiating from their bodies, a gentle, steady heat that contrasted with the coolness of the night outside. I realized then that this wasn't about urgency or dramatic gestures. It was in the patience, the attentiveness, the careful negotiation of space and attention. My hand brushed against the edge of the table near theirs, and instead of pulling away, I let it remain, noticing how each of them seemed to respond in kind, subtle, deliberate, and wholly consensual. There was electricity in restraint, a magnetic pull that didn't need to be named to exist. By the time we all leaned back, coffee cups empty and conversation tapering, there was a silent agreement lingering in the air. It wasn't spoken, but it was understood. The evening had shifted, the walls we carried with us softened, and a quiet, mutual attraction had rooted itself firmly. I could feel it in every glance, every brush of movement, and in the steady rhythm of their breathing near mine. The night was fragile, charged with possibility, yet grounded in respect and tenderness. For the first time, I sensed that this connection, the slow, deliberate, unspoken pull between us, wasn't fleeting. It was something we would carry beyond this cafe, a quiet understanding that lingered in shared silence, in glances, and in the warmth of being truly seen. The night had softened into something almost tangible, a warm, comforting presence that seemed to embrace the three of them and me together in the quiet cafe. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, but inside, the lamplight pooled over wooden tables and polished counters, giving the space a sense of gentle security. We were still there, lingering in the afterglow of conversation, laughter, and the unspoken truths we had shared. I noticed how each of them moved with ease, confident yet relaxed, their gestures gentle and deliberate. One brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, and let her fingers graze the back of my hand for just a moment longer than necessary. Another rested her chin lightly on her folded arms, eyes catching mine with a softness that made my chest tighten pleasantly. The third leaned slightly forward, her gaze warm, attentive, almost waiting for me to speak, yet patient enough to let the silence stretch meaningfully between us. We began to gather our things slowly, either rushing nor wanting to break the fragile bubble we had created. I offered to carry a bag for one of them, and our hands met briefly, a fleeting contact, yet weighted with an unspoken understanding. It was in these small gestures, these quiet exchanges, that the depth of connection revealed itself. No words were necessary, the warmth, attentiveness, and care were enough. As we reached the door, the first woman placed her hand lightly on my shoulder, the skin soft and reassuring. The second offered a brief cheek kiss, delicate and respectful, the kind that lingered in memory long after the physical contact ended. The third held my gaze for a long, silent moment, her eyes conveying curiosity, affection, and trust. I felt the steady pulse of her attention, a quiet affirmation of the bond we had nurtured over the course of the evening. Stepping outside, the cool night air pressed against my skin, but it was softened by the warmth I carried with me, the echo of their presence, the subtle brush of fingers, the lingering fragrance of their perfume. I walked with them a few steps, not wanting to part too abruptly, aware of the quiet electricity humming in the spaces between us. Each gesture, each glance, each fleeting touch had built a bridge of connection that felt sturdy and promising. When we finally said goodnight, it was with a sense of quiet satisfaction rather than longing. This wasn't a story of fleeting attraction, it was the beginning of something measured, deliberate, and real. I walked away with my heart full, not with desperation, but with gratitude, for the laughter, for the vulnerability, for the warmth of a night that had transformed into something deeply meaningful. As the cafe disappeared behind me, I knew that the connection we had formed would not fade with distance or time. It was slow burn, subtle, and entirely human, 3 women who had waited for me after hours, and a man who had discovered, in their company, the profound possibility of trust, affection, and quiet desire. The night ended not with finality, but with promise, a promise that what had begun in gentle touches, lingering glances, and shared vulnerabilities could grow into something tender, respectful, and enduring. The story closed with warmth lingering in the air, a quiet smile on my face, and the knowledge that true connection, once found, changes everything, even in the simplest of cafes after hours.